The courtroom held its breath, a living portrait of expectation and dread. Judge Samuel Wexler, a dignified man in his late 50s with silver-streaked hair and tired eyes, sat behind the oak bench. As he gripped the gavel, his knuckles whitened. The air crackled, press cameras ready, families straining forward in their pews. Every sound died as Judge Wexler said, "This court finds the defendant not guilty." Shock crashed through the room, a wave of gasps, muffled cries, a single woman's sob splitting the silence. Prosecutor Helena Torres shot to her feet, her face blanching, while the defense attorney slumped, momentarily speechless. For an instant, Wexler's gaze met the defendant's. Fear, hope, disbelief tangled in the young man's face. The judge's voice wavered, but the verdict was final. Cameras flashed like lightning. Samuel Wexler felt the full weight of his oath, knowing he had just set fire to his career. The world erupted around him as he brought the gavel down, echoing like thunder. The courthouse doors burst open, unleashing a tidal wave of voices, camera shutters, and flashing lights. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward demanding, "Why, Judge Wexler, what did you see?" He moved through the chaos like a man underwater, face pale, lips pressed in a grim line. His wife, Julia, a dignified woman in her 50s, grasped his arm tightly, shielding him from the barrage. Protesters chanted on the courthouse steps, some hurling insults, others calling for justice, their banners waving in the sunlight. News vans double-parked, journalists elbowed for position, and the air was sharp with accusation. Judge Wexler didn't answer. He kept his eyes straight ahead, his steps steady but slow, the weight of every camera and every cry pressing down on him. Behind his glasses, his eyes were red, torn between stubborn pride and aching regret. Inside a nearby waiting room, the defendant sat motionless, staring at his hands, disbelief etching deep furrows in his brow. His mother knelt beside him, clutching his arm, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're free, Michael. Do you hear me? You're free," she whispered, her voice trembling with both relief and fear. The young man, Michael Torres, couldn't speak, his breath ragged, shoulders shaking. An uncle hovered in the corner, eyes never leaving the door, wary of what the future might hold. Outside, the muffled thunder of the crowd seeped through the walls. Michael's world had tilted. Freedom now felt as heavy as chains. A clock ticked on the wall, relentless as hope warred with terror in the silent space between mother and son. The verdict echoed in Michael's ears, the sound of the gavel impossible to forget. Back inside the courtroom, Prosecutor Helena Torres stood frozen at her table, hands flat, jaw clenched tight. She said, "This is a miscarriage of justice." Her voice echoed, sharp as broken glass. The defense attorney, Peter Lang, slumped into his chair, relief and disbelief battling in his tired eyes. Bailiffs whispered in the aisle, exchanging glances. The gallery remained in stunned silence, some weeping, others glaring at the bench. Sunlight poured through stained glass, casting red and blue patterns across Helena's rigid figure. The judge's empty seat loomed, the gavel still trembling on the wood. For Helena, this was more than a loss. It was a blow to everything she believed in. She stared at the verdict sheet, lips pressed to a bloodless line, her entire career hanging by a thread. Judge Samuel Wexler's hands shook as he retreated to his private chambers, breath coming in shallow bursts. He closed the heavy door, the sound muffled but final. For a moment, he stood in silence, eyes fixed on the mirror above the mantel. The reflection stared back, haunted and older than he remembered. "What have I done?" he whispered, voice barely audible. The room was lined with law books and faded portraits, reminders of his long career, now stained by one act. He dropped the robe onto a chair, its folds slumping in defeat. On the desk, a framed photo of his children smiled up at him, innocent and distant. The gavel lying alone seemed to accuse him. Judge Wexler sank into his chair, shoulders bowed. The verdict echoed in his mind, a thunder he could never take back. Long before the world called him judge, Samuel Wexler was a boy growing up in a cramped city apartment, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. Every evening his father would sit him at the dinner table, voice rough with exhaustion, and say, "A man's word is his worth, Sam. Never forget it." The city lights flickered through the cracked windows, illuminating a childhood spent with battered law books and hand-me-down dreams. Samuel watched injustice unravel in the streets below, neighbors losing homes and hope, and swore to become someone who could tip the scales back to balance. The first time he stood in front of a classroom debate, his hands trembled, but his voice was steady. That night, his mother pressed a kiss to his head and whispered, "You have a gift, Samuel. Never use it to hurt." The lessons clung to him, shaping a heart determined to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. Years later, the name Samuel Wexler would carry weight, spoken in awe, fear or envy by those who heard it. In a stately home lined with plaques and accolades, Samuel's teenage daughter, Emily, watched the news coverage of her father's verdict, her face pale and eyes wide. Julia, Samuel's wife, stood by the kitchen window, shoulders tense as she brewed tea she wouldn't drink. "Why is everyone so angry at Dad?" Emily asked, voice small. Julia forced a smile, though her hands shook as she said, "Sometimes doing the right thing makes you unpopular, sweetheart." The house, usually filled with laughter and piano music, felt like a museum, each framed diploma and award a silent judge. Samuel's legacy was both shield and shackle, and as his family watched the world turn against him, they braced themselves for the storm head unleashed. Judge Wexler sat alone at the foot of his bed, room cloaked in shadows, still wearing his shirt and tie. Julia stood in the doorway, watching him with aching concern. "Samuel, you have to eat something," she urged, voice gentle but strained. He shook his head, staring at the carpet. "I don't know if I did the right thing," he confessed, words barely a whisper. Julia crossed the room and knelt in front of him, placing her hands on his knees. "You followed your conscience. I married you for that." For a moment, they sat in silence, the ticking of the clock the only sound. Samuel closed his eyes, pain and doubt carved into every line of his face. Julia brushed his hair back, her voice trembling. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The weight of her promise anchored him, a fragile hope against the growing storm. Outside their home, tension simmered. The porch was shadowed, the lawn scattered with wind-blown newspapers bearing Samuel's photo and bold headlines. Julia watched from the window as a neighbor crossed the street, eyes averted, dragging a dog hurriedly behind. Emily peered through the blinds, her voice trembling. "They're avoiding us, Mom." Julia squeezed her hand, masking her own fear. The silence in the neighborhood was louder than any protest. Friends who once dropped by with casseroles now drove past with windows up. Samuel paced the living room, restless, the walls closing in. He looked out at the empty street and wondered how a single verdict could turn a community into strangers. In the distance, thunder rolled, promising a long and sleepless night for the family now branded by controversy. That night, Judge Wexler sat alone in his study, pen poised above a blank page. Law books lined the walls, their wisdom suddenly hollow. He started to write a letter, a confession, an explanation, perhaps a plea for understanding, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stared at his own reflection in the window, the city lights flickering behind him. In that moment, Samuel realized justice was never black and white. Every verdict carried a shadow, and his had swallowed him whole. "Was it worth it?" he whispered, voice cracking. The study was silent, but for the hum of distant traffic. With a sigh, he set the pen down and pressed his palm to the glass, feeling the cold seep through. His silhouette, alone against the city's restless glow, marked the beginning of exile, from the world and from himself. The morning after the verdict, Judge Wexler's name was everywhere, splashed across newspapers, blaring from televisions, crawling across social media feeds. News anchors debated his sanity, op-ed columns dissected his motives, and angry callers jammed radio lines with threats and accusations. Julia watched the coverage, hands clasped tight, while Emily scrolled through her phone, her face paling with every new headline. "They're calling you a traitor, Dad," Emily whispered, her voice quivering. Samuel sat rigid at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on the television, absorbing every bob. "You made the right call," Julia said, trying to sound confident, but her voice cracked. Anonymous emails flooded Samuel's inbox, some pleading for justice, others promising retribution. He knew that once his name had stood for integrity. Now it was a target, and the world was aiming right at his heart. Later that day, Samuel met with fellow judges in a paneled conference room, thick with suspicion. Old friends avoided his gaze. Whispers rose and fell like uneasy tides. Judge Grayson, silver-haired and severe, said, "You made us vulnerable, Sam." Others nodded, concern shadowing their faces. "We're all under scrutiny now," someone else added, voice tight. Samuel braced himself, responding, "I stood by my oath." The words sounded hollow in the cold air. As the meeting dissolved into murmurs, Judge Patel, once his closest ally, caught his arm. "You should watch your back," she warned softly. Betrayal flickered behind every handshake, trust dissolving into fear. Samuel left the room feeling stripped of more than just reputation. He'd lost his sense of belonging, replaced by the sting of exile among former friends. Outside the courthouse, a colleague caught up with Samuel as he hurried to his car. Judge Patel, her expression tense, pulled him aside. "There are people who want you gone, Sam. Not just from the bench, from the city." Her voice dropped lower. "You crossed the wrong people." Samuel forced a tight smile. "I knew the risk." She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "You didn't. There are rumors, threats against your family. You should consider leaving, at least for a while." Samuel's jaw clenched, anger and fear wrestling in his chest. He had always believed in the system's strength, but now the shadows had faces, and his family was in the crosshairs. "Thank you, Priya," he murmured, voice rough. As she hurried away, Samuel stood in the parking lot, suddenly smaller beneath the broad, threatening sky. That evening, as rain began to patter against the windows, the Torres family, still shaken, arrived at the Wexler home. Michael, the young man Judge Wexler had acquitted, stood on the porch with his mother and uncle, gratitude and anxiety written across their faces. Julia answered the door, surprise flickering in her eyes. "We had to thank you," Michael's mother said, her voice raw. Samuel invited them in, tension tightening his posture. "You gave us back our son," she continued, gripping Samuel's hand. Michael, still stunned, murmured, "I don't know how to live with this freedom, sir." Samuel nodded, sensing the burdens of both mercy and guilt. For a moment, two families united by tragedy and relief stood together in the quiet foyer, the storm outside echoing the emotional turbulence within. Night fell heavy on the Wexler house. As the Torres family left, Julia quietly locked the door and drew the curtains. Samuel wandered the hallway, feeling every shadow stretch longer in the lamplight. Upstairs, Emily sobbed into her pillow, broken by classmates' cruel messages. Julia found Samuel at the bottom of the stairs, his face hollowed by exhaustion. "They're threatening Emily now," Julia whispered, voice raw. Samuel's hands shook as he replied, "I never thought it would reach our daughter." The truth settled between them, cold and implacable. For the first time, Samuel saw the consequences reaching past himself, threatening to unravel the people he loved most. He gathered Julia into his arms, both clinging to the hope that love could endure even when the world was set against them. As the storm outside broke into a relentless downpour, Judge Wexler combed through boxes of old court files in his study, desperate to understand what he'd missed. Flickering lamplight cast shadows across his desk as he uncovered a thin folder buried deep beneath other cases. Inside was a forgotten piece of evidence, a security tape with a handwritten date that didn't match the official record. Samuel's heart pounded. He played the tape on an old laptop, watching as new faces and movements emerged on the grainy screen. This detail, unnoticed in the frenzy of trial, revealed a shadowy figure entering the crime scene at an hour previously dismissed. Samuel leaned forward, realization dawning. This was the thread that could unravel the entire case. Outside, thunder rattled the windows, But inside, the quiet revelation hit with even greater force. Haunted by the revelation, Samuel's mind raced back to the night before the verdict. He recalled a secretive meeting with Peter Lang, the defense attorney, in a deserted courthouse hallway. Peter's eyes darted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's more to this than you know, Sam. Pressure from above. The DA wants this conviction no matter the truth. Be careful." Samuel remembered the cold chill that followed those words, the sense that invisible hands were guiding the outcome of the trial. Now, with the new evidence in hand, the meaning behind Peter's warning felt urgent and deadly. The judge's memory sharpened, each detail of that encounter filling him with dread as he realized just how many forces were working to manipulate justice from the shadows. Determined to confront the truth, Samuel sought out Peter Lang at his modest office downtown. Rain drummed on the window as Peter sat behind a cluttered desk, jaw clenched. "You were right," Samuel said, voice low. Peter hesitated, then leaned in. "I had to choose, Sam. If I pushed too hard, I'd lose my license, or worse. The prosecution buried evidence and the DA's office threatened me." Samuel's fists tightened on the chair arms, outrage burning beneath the surface. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he demanded. Peter's eyes glistened with shame. "I was scared." The silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. In that moment, Samuel realized the system he'd devoted his life to was riddled with corruption and fear, and that he was running out of time to save what little justice remained. Samuel's investigation led him to the prosecutor's office, where he confronted Helena Torres late at night. She stood at her desk, arms crossed, eyes defiant. "You don't belong here, Sam," Helena spat. Samuel placed the security tape on her desk, saying, "Explain this." Helena's composure cracked. Her hands trembled as she examined the evidence. "You have no idea what you're meddling with," she warned. "There are careers, lives, at stake." Samuel pressed. "Is that what justice means now? Protecting the powerful?" The tension in the room was electric, Helena caught between fury and fear. Outside, city lights flickered as the two adversaries stood locked in a battle far bigger than either had imagined. A struggle not just for a verdict, but for the soul of the law itself. Alone in his car beneath the pounding rain, Samuel replayed the night's discoveries, mind churning with new fears. The evidence he'd found wasn't just a loose thread, it was a fuse. Exposing the truth would destroy careers and bring powerful enemies to his doorstep. He stared at his reflection in the rain-speckled windshield, memories of his oath echoing in his mind. In that silent moment, Samuel made his decision. He would risk everything for justice, even if it meant losing all he'd built. Lightning flashed, illuminating his determined face. The world outside his car was a blur, but inside, resolve took root. He gripped the steering wheel, breath steadying. No more secrets. No more fear. As thunder shook the city, Samuel drove into the night, ready to face whatever awaited him on the other side. The next morning, Samuel faced the disciplinary board in a towering, marble-paneled chamber. Rows of stern-faced officials sat in judgment, their expressions unreadable. The air was icy, thick with accusation and old rivalries. Samuel stood at a podium, voice trembling only at the edges. "I stand by my decision," he said, "even if it costs me everything." The board chair, a formidable woman in her 70s, replied, "Your actions have shaken faith in this institution, Judge Wexler." Murmurs rippled through the chamber as Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. He saw his family in the back row, Julia gripping Emily's hand, both trying to appear strong. The hearing felt less like justice, and more like a reckoning, with Samuel's entire career teetering on the edge of ruin. He wondered if the truth would survive this room, or if it would be buried here forever. As Samuel prepared to defend himself, his closest ally, Judge Patel, was called to testify. She entered, avoiding Samuel's gaze, her face set in painful resignation. Under the board's questioning, she hesitated before finally saying, "Judge Wexler has always acted with integrity, but recent choices have cast doubt." Samuel felt each word like a blow. The chairwoman pressed, Would you trust him on the bench again? Judge Patel's answer was barely audible. I'm not sure. Betrayal stung sharp, and Samuel's chest tightened as the realization dawned. Isolation was complete. Even those who once stood with him had been turned by fear and pressure. Judge Patel's shoulders slumped as she left the stand, her silence more damning than any testimony. Samuel looked down, fighting the urge to despair, clinging to the last shreds of his conviction. Outside the chamber, Julia and Emily stood together in a narrow hallway, the world pressing in. Reporters clustered at the end of the corridor, voices echoing. Julia whispered, "We'll get through this." But Emily's phone buzzed with new threats and insults, her fingers trembling as she read. "Why are they doing this?" she asked, voice breaking. Julia pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace, shielding her from flashing cameras. "Because people fear what they don't understand, and hate what they fear," Julia said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Emily buried her face in her mother's shoulder, muffling a sob. The sacrifices Samuel had made had become their sacrifices too. The hallway felt endless, every step forward weighed down by the judgment of strangers and the relentless glare of a world hungry for scandal. The media, relentless and merciless, dredged up every blemish from Samuel's past. Old case files, minor missteps, even grainy photos from his early career, now dominated headlines and airwaves. Has Wexler always been a rebel? A news anchor intoned while pundits debated his legacy. Julia watched in horror as Samuel's image, once a symbol of integrity, became a caricature of scandal. Neighbors whispered and withdrew. Invitations vanished. Samuel walked the city in a daze, his name now synonymous with controversy. In every cafe, every park, eyes lingered a moment too long. Even the most innocent smile felt laced with accusation. Alone at night, Samuel wondered if anyone would ever remember the reasons for his stand, or if his downfall would become his only story. A week later, Samuel sat in a local cafe, sunlight pooling across a battered table. The low hum of conversation paused when he entered. Some patrons stared, others looked away. As he sipped his coffee, an elderly man approached, weathered hands shaking. "You did what was right, son," the old man said quietly. "Don't let the mob convince you otherwise." Samuel's eyes stung, the first kind words had heard in days. The man patted his shoulder, then left, melting into the crowd. For a brief moment, hope flickered. But as Samuel finished his drink, his phone buzzed, more threats, more anger. He looked around the room, searching for empathy in a sea of suspicion. The world had become a battlefield, and Samuel understood now, redemption, if it came at all, would be won alone. Samuel stood in a packed courtroom, this time not as a judge but as a man on trial for his own decisions. Naivety. Journalists filled the gallery, scribbling every word, while the disciplinary board presided from the bench with stony faces. Samuel's voice rang clear, if unsteady. "I was sworn to seek justice, not vengeance. I refuse to be a tool for corruption." His words echoed across the silent room, landing like stones in a pond. Julia and Emily sat side by side, fingers intertwined, their faces taut with fear and pride. Samuel looked directly at his peers, meeting each gaze. "If defending the truth is a crime, then I stand guilty." The board's chair nodded gravely, signaling for the next witness. Samuel's future balanced on every syllable, but for the first time shame no longer weighed on his shoulders, only conviction. As Samuel's defense faltered, the room hushed when a surprise witness was called. Peter Lang, the defense attorney, entered, nerves visible in his clenched jaw. He approached the stand and after a pause said, "Judge Wexler saved an innocent man? I was pressured to bury evidence and to mislead the court. The real crime is the corruption no one wants to see." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. The board's chair leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "You realize what you're confessing, Mr. Lang?" Peter nodded, voice trembling but firm. "It's time for someone to speak the truth." Samuel met Peter's gaze, relief, gratitude, and shared pain passing silently between them. Suddenly, the story was no longer just about one judge's downfall, but about the darkness hiding in plain sight, and the courage it took to bring it to light. Chaos erupted as Peter finished his testimony. Reporters jostled for quotes, board members exchanged urgent whispers, and the gallery buzzed with disbelief. Julia clung to Emily's hand, tears welling in her eyes. The board struggled to regain order, gavels pounding. "Order! Order in the court!" barked the chairwoman. A board member shouted, "If these allegations are true, we need a full investigation." For a moment, hope flickered in Samuel's heart, the possibility that his ordeal might spark something bigger. But danger lingered in every corner. Powerful figures glared from the back row, their expressions dark and calculating. Samuel sensed the tides turning, but also the gathering storm that came with exposing the truth. The room felt volatile, caught between collapse and the faintest promise of justice. Silence finally returned, and Samuel was called to deliver his final statement. He rose slowly, feeling the eyes of every person in the room. This trial was never about one verdict. It's about whether we let fear and power dictate justice. If my career ends today, let it end for the right reasons. His words were measured, but every syllable was a challenge. The board members leaned in, listening intently. My family paid for my decision. My conscience is my only defense. Julia nodded through her tears, and Emily managed a trembling smile. As Samuel stepped back, his heart pounded not with fear, but with pride. Whatever came next, he knew he had reclaimed his voice. The verdict was out of his hands, but his integrity, hard-won and unbroken, would not be taken from him. The board retired to deliberate, leaving Samuel and his family in suspense. The room slowly emptied, whispers swirling as reporters hustled to file their stories. Julia squeezed Samuel's hand, her voice steady. "No matter what they decide, I'm proud of you." Emily looked up, her eyes shining with fierce loyalty. "You taught me what it means to be brave." Samuel finally allowed himself a small, weary smile. Together they sat in the fading light, surrounded by the echo of gavel strikes and a world forever changed by his stand. Through the window, the city stretched out, restless and uncertain, but Samuel felt something new, a sense of peace that came from knowing he had chosen integrity over comfort. In the end, that choice was all he could control. Days passed before the verdict arrived. Samuel and his family sat in their quiet living room, sunlight breaking through storm clouds, casting long stripes across the floor. The phone finally rang. A single, shattering moment. Julia answered, her hands shaking. After a brief, tense conversation, she hung up and turned to Samuel and Emily. "They've removed you from the bench," she whispered, her voice trembling but calm. Samuel closed his eyes, letting the truth settle. There were no tears, just an ache that reached all the way through him. He drew his wife and daughter close, pressing a kiss to each forehead. "We still have each other," he said, voice thick with emotion. The world outside was silent, as if holding its breath for what would come next. For the first time, Samuel allowed himself to grieve, and to let go. Word of Samuel's removal spread quickly. News vans returned, neighbors watched through their blinds, and opinions swirled online. Some called him a hero, others a fool. Samuel retreated into the backyard, seeking peace beneath an old oak tree. Emily joined him, her school bag slung over one shoulder, and sat beside him on the grass. "You always told me to stand up for what's right, even if it's hard," she said softly. Samuel smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "It was never just about the robe. It's about being able to look yourself in the mirror." Emily rested her head on his shoulder. In that moment, the world's noise faded. For father and daughter, the pain of loss mingled with the hope of legacy, a quiet bond forged in the aftermath of sacrifice. In the weeks that followed, Samuel tried to rebuild a new life. He volunteered at a legal aid clinic, helping those who had nowhere else to turn. The office was small, bustling with need, a world away from marble courtrooms. Samuel found purpose in each small victory. An eviction halted, a family reunited. Clients thanked him with grateful tears, unaware of his past renown. Samuel's days filled with new routines, his nights quieter, haunted less by regret and more by a sense of fragile hope. One evening Julia visited the clinic, bringing him coffee and a tired smile. "You never stopped fighting," she said. Samuel reached for her hand, realizing that dignity was not in a title, but in the daily choice to serve. In that humble office, the seeds of redemption began to sprout. Not all wounds healed quickly. Julia faced stares at the grocery store, and Emily struggled with whispers at school. But around the dinner table, laughter gradually returned. One evening, as rain tapped on the windows, Samuel shared stories from the clinic, his voice brighter than it had been in months. Emily listened, eyes shining with pride. Julia leaned across the table, touching Samuel's hand. "You gave up everything for the truth," she said. "But you never lost who you are." The family's scars remained, but so did their resilience, a testament to what could survive the storm. As the rain subsided and the world outside softened, Samuel realized that courage was measured not by victory, but by the grace to start again after every fall. On a quiet morning, Samuel walked alone through the city, the courthouse visible in the distance. He paused at the steps, rain-washed stone gleaming under a pale sky. For a moment, he stood motionless, listening to the city's heartbeat, its traffic, its voices, its endless rush. In his pocket he carried the old gavel, now a relic of a life transformed. He looked back only once, then turned away, his footsteps echoing with finality. The battle had cost him nearly everything, but it had given him a rare gift, clarity. As he disappeared into the city's currents, Samuel's final words lingered in memory. "Let them remember not the robe, but the man who refused to look away." The world moved on, but his stand would echo in its conscience for years to come.